So, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. We have an excellent speaker to talk to us about a fabulous book that many of us have read and maybe not everybody. So we have Steven Ujifusa. He is a historian who chronicles the influence of American business, social, and maritime history. His third book, The Last Ships from Hamburg, Business, Rivalry, and the Race to Save Russia's Jews on the Eve of World War I, tells the story of Eastern European Jewish immigration to America in the late 19th and 20th centuries. It came out in late 2023 from HarperCollins and was named by Publishers Weekly as one of the best books of the year. So if you haven't read it yet, I think what you are going to hear tonight is going to be enough to make you want to read it. Anyway, his second book, Barons of the Sea and Their Race to Build the World's Fastest Clipper Ship, tells the saga of the great 19th century American clipper ships and the Yankee merchant dynasties they created. In 2012, the Wall Street Journal named his first book, A Man and His Ship. You see a theme here? America's greatest naval architect in his quest to build the SS United States as one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the year. Steven is the recipient of the Washington Irving Medal for Literary Excellence from the St. Nicholas Society of the City of New York, a MacDowell Artist Residency, and the Athenaeum of Philadelphia's Literary Award for Nonfiction. He has appeared on National Public Radio, CBS Sunday Morning, and numerous other media outlets, and contributes frequently to the urban history website phillyhistory.org. As a corporate historian and president of Tradewinds History, LLC, he's the author of Local for the Long Term, A History of Air Gas, Inc., and Creative Capital, the official history of J.M. Forbes and Company, one of the oldest independent financial services firms in the U.S. Other clients include the Paul Foundation of Essex, Connecticut, as well as individuals seeking to preserve the stories of their families, businesses, and homes. A native of New York City and raised in Chappaqua, New York, Steven received his undergraduate degree in history from Harvard University and a master's in historic preservation and real estate development from the University of Pennsylvania. An amateur singer, he's a longtime member of the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia, and he lives in Philadelphia with his wife, who I believe is a physician, and two little boys who are, one hopes, going to sleep right now. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Steven. I have everybody muted. If later on we'll do a Q&A. And if you have any questions, you can indicate by raising your hands at that point. But he's got a really interesting PowerPoint he's going to show us first. And I think you can now go and share your screen. And we are recording this. Okay.
Well, good evening to the Port Jewish Center. This is it's an honor to be here. Greetings from Philadelphia. And this book came out, just over a year ago. A very momentous, and everyone knows, a very scary time for the Jewish community. And this story, The Last Ships from Hamburg, I started writing it in 2019, in the summer of 2019, before COVID. So during this writing period and research period, the world has definitely changed a huge amount. But what inspired me to write this story is kind of a story that's, for me, this is a personal story. My mom's family is Jewish, and they, like so many hundreds of thousands of others families, they came to America between 1881 and 1914 from the Russian Empire, seeking freedom from persecution, violence, military conscription. And my grandmother on my mom's side, who's passed away at 98 in 2015, she was a large influence in my own trajectory as a historian, as a writer, and a thinker. She was a second generation American. Her parents came over, and she was the youngest of 8 children. And I remember asking her, a lot, did your parents ever talk about the old country? Did they ever talk about the area that is now Belarus, where they're from? And she said no. It was kind of a subject that was veiled in silence, and they saw themselves as Americans. and they wanted to forget about that. And I realized that this veil of silence is very prevalent through the descendants of Ashkenazi Jews from the Russian Empire. And the historian Daniel Jurgen, who I've gotten to know and has thought highly of this book, he also is a descendant of Russian Jews. He said that The Last Ships from Hamburg is the sequel to Fiddler on the Roof. We all know the ending of Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye and his family, all the village and all their property has been confiscated by the Tsar. If you remember that scene where the rabbi says, "May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us." There was no love for the Tsar, and the Tsar had no love for the Jewish people, for the 4 million Jews within the borders of the Russian Empire. And so Tevye and his family are forced to leave their little shtetl of Anatevka, located in the western part of the empire. And they sing about how this place is awful, it's a dump. Someone sort of set a match to this place years ago, but where else could Sabbath be so sweet? And we see them leaving, carrying everything they have, all their belongings, and the curtain falls. We don't know how Tevye and his family got to America. We have this image in our mind of Jewish immigrants um, running out on the decks of these steamships as they entered New York Harbor and waving at the Statue of Liberty and crying, but we don't know how they got to the sea. And this story tells this whole journey of how 2.5 million Jews from the Russian Empire, Austria-Hungary, Romania, uh, the Baltic states got out. And this family shown here is a typical Jewish family. And this journey was not just something that was 3,000 miles across the ocean, but this family is shown here in the port of Hamburg, Germany, the largest port of departure for Jewish migrants out of Europe. And they have just endured a 1,000-mile train journey uh, and, through Germany. They had also probably crossed the border illegally between Russia and Germany. They had sold everything they had, and now they're waiting to board their ship. They'd never seen the ocean before. They are scared, they're nervous, they're excited. And this is the story that most American Jews have in their family history of this traumatic sort of leaving everything they knew. And the question then is now, with migrants then and migrants now, is what would cause people to leave everything they knew, villages they'd known for centuries, to leave and seek and take a chance in the new world? Hold on. And oops, that didn't work. And these families like this Jewish family shown here, they and their descendants became so many people that became icons of American culture. And uh, many of them, especially the second generation, they reinvented themselves as Americans. It was uh, Jewish immigrants and second generation Americans of Jewish ancestry who invented modern Hollywood, like Lauren Bacall, who was originally Betty Joan Persky, whose mother and grandparents came to this country from Romania in 1902. You had Felix Frankfurter, who was an immigrant from Austria-Hungary, and he rose to become a Supreme Court justice. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, I believe, she was the granddaughter of Jewish immigrants. And of course, icons of American music and culture, Irving Berlin, who became known as America's songsmith, or America's tunesmith. He came to this country in the mid-1890s as a 5-year-old boy, and he remembered seeing the Statue of Liberty. And at the base of the statue was carved that famous poem by Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Irving Berlin would eventually set that poem to music. He also wrote uh, patriotic American hits such as "God Bless America," which one could argue is our second national anthem. George Gershwin created the modern American musical. And he started off as the son of immigrants on the Lower East Side, and he fused classical, jazz, African American, Yiddish theater into a cohesive whole. And of course, where would we be without Jewish humor, Borscht Belt humor, most notably the Marx Brothers? A friend of mine from Philadelphia who is from a very waspy background told me, uh, you know what? The humor of America is Jewish humor. Before the Jews came, aside from Mark Twain, I don't think we were very funny. And we have Jewish comedy to is another great contribution that these immigrants gave of themselves. In many ways, they came to America. Many ways were perplexed and struggled and were bewildered, but eventually they reflected America back at us. My own family story is much more typical than we aren't exactly Gershwins or Berlins, but my on my mom's side, our family was one of many immigrants who came over from the Russian Empire. My great grandfather Isaac and his wife Anna came over around 1895, and they settled in Brooklyn, New York. My grandmother Judy was the youngest of 8 children, and she was born in 1916, and she grew up in a middle-class family. By the time she was a teenager, her father had made pretty good fortune selling butter and eggs. He probably started off with a push cart, and he wanted to give his children everything he never had. Uh, Anyone in the family who wanted to go to college, including the girls, were allowed to go. My grandmother went to NYU, and there she met my grandfather, Jerome Brooks, who was the son of the publisher of the Jewish Day, one of the major Jewish newspapers in town. And you can see this picture from their 1937 annual. They are trying to look Americans, like so many second generation immigrants, Jewish or not Jewish, past or present. They wanted to assimilate. They wanted to become Americans, and they're trying to look. They look almost like it's striking almost Hollywood poses here. But once again, there was that veil of silence when I asked my grandmother, "What did they ever talk about it?" And she said no. She said every 4th of July, her father made a big point of hanging a big American flag over the stoop of their townhouse in Brooklyn, and he saw America as a marvelous place, a place where someone like him could make a great living and raise a family. But what were they fleeing from? What were our ancestors fleeing from uh, in the old country that was so terrible? Well, it began with a bomb blast in 1881 with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Tsar Alexander II was a relatively liberal czar compared to his predecessors. He had famously freed Russia's millions of serfs in 1861, 2 years before Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So, one very rare aspect, Russia was ahead of the United States. But he was killed by an anarchist group. A bomb was thrown at his carriage. His son, Alexander III, took over. And Alexander III decided to pull Russia into a hard right reactionary uh, mindset and direction. He hated and was very suspicious of things such as liberal democracy and constitutional government and representative government. He believed that Russia needed a good old-fashioned dose of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. He saw what was going on with Great Britain, where Queen Victoria was basically reduced to a figurehead. He saw France, which had become a republic, and he's like, this is decadent, this is scary, this is not for Russia. And he cracked down hard on Russia's intelligentsia, on its universities. But he had one group that he really focused his anger on and blamed for the death of his father, Russia's 4 million Jews. He began a program, what was known as Russification. Russia had a lot of minorities within its borders. You not just had Jews, but you also had Muslim Uzbeks. In Central Asia, you had uh, Georgians, you had Ukrainians, people who did not fit the traditional Russian mold. And he basically began a program of wiping out education and culture in these parts of his empire. But his hatred for the Jews was a religious one. He labeled Jews as Christ killers, and he said the Jews must be punished for what they have done in this country. And he had a multi-pronged approach in his program of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. The first was military conscription, in which young Jewish boys as young as 10 or 11 or 12 years old were taken away from their parents, drafted into the Russian army for up to 20 years. And if they came back alive, and most of them did not, they would come back as Russian Orthodox. They wouldn't know their family, their faith. He also, Russia was going through immense problems at this time with rapid industrialization, wealth inequality, labor unrest, civil strife. A convenient target was to blame the Jews for that, and as a way to sort of blow off steam, he basically sanctioned pogroms. Ordinary Russian citizens, if they began getting upset about something, the czarist government would encourage the press to gin up hatred of Jews that would often break out into horrible, horrible violence in the Russian Pale of Settlement, in which villages were burned down, women were raped, and children killed. It was horrible. And his advisor in this enterprise was a cleric and lawyer named Konstantin Papadonostev, who apparently was the model for Anna Karena's husband in Tolstoy's novel. And he believed that the solution for Russia's Jewish question, as he called it, Karl Marx said the same thing, by the way, was that one third of all Russia's Jews should die, one third should just immigrate, and one third should disappear. So this led to Russia's 4 million Jews asking a very difficult question. Should they move to larger cities and sort of disappear into the crowds? Should they move to the Russian province of Poland, which had somewhat more liberal attitudes towards Jews? There was sort of an exception in Poland. Should they try to immigrate to Western Europe? In Western Europe, especially places like Germany and Austria-Hungary, Jews were given full citizenship rights. The Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary declared that anti-Semitism was against Habsburg royal policy and that was outdated. That was the law, but not necessarily in practice. But there was a great flowering of Jewish life in Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, thanks to its liberation. But most of these Western European countries did not want all these refugees. And Russia had no major ports that had direct service to the one country that could take them and had relatively liberal immigration laws. That was the United States. Well, enter an unlikely person to basically lead this exodus. Albert Ballin was a German Jew. He was from the city of Hamburg. He was born to a lower middle class and downwardly mobile family. He was born in 1857. His father owned an immigration ticketing agency, which bought steamship tickets in bulk from the large steamship companies and sold them to immigrants coming to port cities such as Hamburg and Bremen, looking for passage to America. His father died in 1873 when he was only 17 years old, and he had to go out and work for a living. He took over his father's business, and he eventually became so good at selling tickets that he partnered with a small steamship line that offered indirect service, indirect immigration from Hamburg to London or Liverpool, and then these immigrants would get on large British ships that would sail to New York. But he was doing such a big business that the largest shipping company in town, the Hamburg-American Line, also known as Hapag, using for its German abbreviation, they took notice of this guy and saw him as a threat. So they decided to buy him out, and they made him chief of their passenger division to basically funnel immigrants into their ships. This was a huge coup for him. And by 1899, Albert Ballin rose to become the general director of the Hamburg-American Line. And he grew it to become the largest steamship company in the entire world. Big feather in the cap for the new nation of Germany, which was unified in 1871. Albert Ballin, like a lot of German Jews, had tremendous enthusiasm and patriotism for this new German state. They felt that they were going to be part of this new, modern, technologically advanced, scientific country that was going to lead Europe in science and industry and banking. And Jews were a big part of that in pre-World War I Germany. They were disproportionately represented in business and banking, academia, publishing. And Albert Ballin was part of this group of optimistic German Jews. He married a Gentile woman in 1885, which was very unusual at the time. Most Jews did not marry out, but he did. And they raised their daughter, who they adopted at age 2, was a Lutheran, but he refused to convert to Christianity. He felt that he would be dishonoring the member of his dead father if he would. And uh, he basically made a deal with the German government because you had all these refugees, mostly Jewish refugees, basically amassing at the border between Russia and Germany, who were trying to get out and trying to get on these ships. And it was basically a humanitarian crisis. And Albert Ballin said, look, Your Majesty, my company will take over the administration of these border control stations. We will make sure that everyone who comes through has a ticket. We'll make sure that they are inspected for disease so they won't be rejected in America and they won't spread disease in Germany. We will put them on sealed trains and send them to Hamburg or Bremen or other large ports and then put them on ships. And for those immigrants that did not have the money, he made sort of a deal with the German Jewish Aid Society that would give subsidies to immigrants wanting to buy Hapag tickets. So this was an unusual deal, privatized border control. And this made Albert Ballin a very wealthy man. It made Hapag one of the premier companies in Germany, right up there with Daimler-Benz and Siemens. And its slogan was, "My field is the world," because the Hamburg-American Line would not just sail ships across the Atlantic, but they eventually had routes that spanned to the Far East and to Africa, to Germany's growing colonial empire. The Kaiser admired Albert Ballin because he made Germany look good. But Albert Ballin, it was a very awkward relationship. I don't know if you can call it a friendship, but Albert Ballin was designated as being worthy of being presented at court. He was a frequent visitor in Berlin. And the Kaiser loved talking to Albert Ballin because he was so intelligent and so insightful. But Albert Ballin always had this feeling that when he was in Berlin, when he was surrounded by the Kaiser and his inner circle of Prussian aristocrats who were very anti-Semitic, he felt they don't like me. He knew that the Empress, Augusta Victoria, despised him. He always felt the sense of discomfort that he was, on one hand, a good patriotic German, but he always knew that a lot of the people in the governing class in Germany didn't like him. His best friend was another Jew, the banker Max Warburg of the famous Warburg banking family. And Max Warburg ran the largest investment bank in Hamburg and basically raised capital to allow the Hamburg-American Line to grow and build bigger and more luxurious and faster ships. Albert Ballin pioneered things that we take for granted today, such as the pleasure cruise. Up into the 1890s, people didn't want to go on a ship for fun. It was not a comfortable thing. But by the 1890s, ships had electric lights and heating and eventually became destinations in themselves. And he built the first purpose-built cruise ship, Prinzessin Victoria Louise, named after the Kaiser's daughter, which sailed to Scandinavia and the Caribbean. He also pioneered the concept of the ship as a floating hotel, as a luxurious destination, at least for first class. He had an exclusive partnership with the Ritz-Carlton Company to operate specialty restaurants on board Hamburg-American Line ships only. So this became a very popular marketing ploy in which people would pay extra to eat in a Ritz-Carlton branded restaurant on a Hapag ship. Albert Ballin, like a lot of people who came from poor backgrounds, I think he liked living the good life. He had fine attention for detail. He would walk all over his ships, inspecting them, making sure they were perfect and always looking for improvements. But Max Warburg and he had this very, very close friendship. They had a phone line connecting the Hamburg-American Line offices to the M.M. Warburg and Company offices across the Ferdinandstrasse in Hamburg. The two of them would go for a walk around the Ulster Lake for an hour or 2 hours every day in which they would discuss ideas. So Max Warburg was sort of the brother that Albert Ballin never had. And Max Warburg was also related by marriage to many other prominent German Jewish banking families, both in the fatherland and also in the United States. More on that later. But Albert Ballin would declare that without the steerage business, without third class, uh, Hamburg-America would be broke in 2 weeks. And he was suffered a lot of backlash from the Jewish community in Germany, who called him an exploiter of his own people. His response was, well, there's a market need and people need to use my ships. So it's a business. I have stockholders to be accountable for. And he also built this entire immigrant village in Hamburg, part of which still survives, which could house up to 10,000 migrants at a time. It was sealed off from the city. It had a church, a synagogue, a kosher dining hall, a non-kosher dining hall, and immigrants could wait up to 2 weeks before their ship sailed. He was loathed by the German far right. The court preacher Adolf Stocker, who was also a member of the Reichstag, declared that it was really disgusting and terrifying that, as he called, the strangers from Palestine have gotten so close to the Kaiser and the royal family. I mean, it was really, there was worse things said about Albert Ballin. He was also disliked by the social democrat movement and the far left, who saw him as a capitalist exploiter. But a typical Hamburg-American Line ship around 1905, let's take the Kaiser and Augusta Victoria, was around 730 feet long, would have 500 in first class, 300 in second class, and 2 to 3,000 in steerage. What were conditions like in steerage? Well, pretty bad by any standard. Thousands of people were crammed into the bottoms of these big liners. A lot of ships didn't have separate dining spaces. You ate and slept in the same space. I can't imagine as a family traveling in a space like this. Albert Ballin pioneered kosher food service on his ships in 1905. He also made the first provisions for separate cabins for families traveling together. But the class tensions on these ships was palpable. And often Jewish passengers were segregated from the other passengers in third class because of fear of actual pogroms breaking out on board, violence breaking out on board. Now, contrast steerage in third class with the magnificence of first class on a Haupt ship. This is the first class lounge of the SS Imperator of 1913, a ship, by the way, which was bigger than the Titanic. And that first class lounge was decorated by the same firm that did the Ritz-Carlton in London. So just the contrast is just incredible on these ships. Well, what was waiting for these immigrants, these Jewish immigrants on the other side when they managed to pass through Ellis Island and settled on the Lower East Side, or in New York, or on the north side of Beacon Hill in Boston, or South Philadelphia? Well, you had a whole network of charitable organizations that basically took the place of government aid that helped these immigrants get on their feet. And it was masterminded by a Jewish immigrant named Jacob Henry Schiff. He was born in 1847 in Frankfurt, Germany. His family lived next door to the Rothschilds. His father worked for the Rothschilds, actually, before they became big time, really big time, that branch. And Jacob Henry Schiff left for America in 1865 with $500 and a packet of kosher meat that his father hoped would last the entire crossing, so he wouldn't have to eat pork or something awful on the ship. Jacob Henry Schiff took a job at a dry goods firm called Kuhn, Loeb Company that eventually became an investment banking firm. He had the good sense to fall in love with the head partner's daughter, Teresa Loeb. And after marrying Teresa Loeb, he told his new father-in-law, Solomon Loeb, we should get into what the future is in terms of investment banking. We should invest in railroads. We should underwrite railroad securities. Solomon Loeb was a very conservative man and thought this young upstart was out of his mind. But Jacob Schiff said, just give me a chance. By the 1890s, Kuhn, Loeb Company is second only to J.P. Morgan as an investment bank on Wall Street. They become the investment bankers to the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Union Pacific, and to the Rockefeller family. This turns Jacob Henry Schiff into the richest Jew in America. Jacob Henry Schiff does not have many hobbies. He was a very serious man, a workaholic. He did not sail yachts. He did not own ridiculously sized mansions. I mean, he lived well. But his main interest was Judaism. and he gave generously to Jewish seminaries, to the Montefiore Hospital, to groups such as the Henry Street Settlement House, which gave immigrants a head start in the English language and vocations. But he decided that America was the new promised land, the new Israel for the world's Jews. He never lost his love for Germany. He despised Russia. He called the Tsar the great Satan of the Jewish people. He said, it is my goal to bring over as many Russian Jews as possible to America to escape the clutches of the evil Tsar. And this network he set up was incredible, a very powerful network of philanthropy that provided for Jews once they arrived in America. He did have this rather strange idea of turning the port of Galveston into a rival to New York City because he was afraid that Jews were getting too concentrated on the East Coast in cities like Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and Boston. They need to be spread out throughout the country. The Galveston plan ultimately didn't really work, but he wanted more Jews to live throughout America. And he was a great believer in the American form of government. And there was a big clash between the German Jews and the Russian Jews, however, because the German Jews, most of them came over in the 1840s and 1850s. They were culturally German. A lot of them became quite wealthy by the 1880s and 1890s and were much more sort of traditionally bourgeois. And the Russian Jews, on the other hand, were poor. They spoke what a lot of the German Jews saw as a kind of low version of German, Yiddish. And a lot of them were very, very far left, revolutionaries almost. And that made a lot of people uncomfortable, especially a lot of the German Jews who were more sort of traditional. But Jacob Henry Schiff said, we must welcome them. They are fleeing Pharaoh. They're fleeing the Pharaoh of our modern times, and we must uplift them. A lot of the Russian Jews resented this because they felt that Jacob Henry Schiff and the German Jews were talking down to them and telling them what to do. So it was a symbiotic and not always very comfortable relationship, but it was an essential one. And Jacob Henry Schiff, his daughter Frida married a gentleman named Felix Warburg, who was Max Warburg's brother. So this interlinked Kuhn, Loeb Company with Warburg and Company in Germany. And there's a lot of money flowing back and forth when it came to building up the Hamburg-American Line and also in Jewish charities. Now, I've often been asked, how did J.P. Morgan get involved in the story? He's sort of the arch goyim. Well, he saw what Albert Ballin was doing, and being the good organizer that he was, he said, well, I've consolidated railroads, I've consolidated steel, I've consolidated every sector of the American industrial economy under the sun. But the steamship business is a very lucrative one, especially with all those immigrants. I'm going to try to buy up every single steamship company on the Atlantic and crunch them into a single corporation, a trust, which he would call the International Mercantile Marine. This trust was the brainchild of a Philadelphia Quaker shipping magnate named Clement Griscom, who owned a company called the Red Star Line, which sailed ships from Antwerp to Philadelphia and Antwerp to New York. One of the reasons why there's a large number of Jews in Philadelphia is because of the Red Star Line. And Clement Griscom said, let's do a roll-up. Let's try to buy up the White Star Line, the Cunard Line, the Hamburg-American Line, and we'll put them all under Morgan's control. Morgan was Clement Griscom's banker. And this was the one instance in which, one of the very few instances, which J.P. Morgan fails. He buys the White Star Line, premier British shipping company, in 1902 for $32 million. He tries to buy the Cunard Line. The British Admiralty says, nope, can't do that. The Parliament blocks the sale. He buys the Holland-America Line. He buys several other smaller lines, but he can't buy the German lines. He tries, but the Kaiser blocks the sale. Albert Ballin is instrumental behind the scenes in making sure that the Hamburg-America Line is not sold to Morgan. Morgan is frustrated by this. He knows that the German lines have the biggest flow of immigrants, and he tries to make a deal with Albert Ballin. J.P. Morgan, by the way, was quietly quite anti-Semitic in private. He never hired Jews, but he approached Albert Ballin and said, I will offer you $1 million a year to come work for me, come to New York and become the head of this international mercantile marine. Albert Ballin said, Mr. Morgan, no thank you. I am loyal to Germany and I'm loyal to the company that I basically built from the ground up. No. He also knew that Morgan's company was not going to work, and it did not work. It was grossly overcapitalized. It was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. The only company that was profitable was the White Star Line, which had a very robust immigrant business. And it was under Morgan and Ballin that these two companies began a competition for a trio. Each company decided to build a trio of the grandest liners ever known that could carry not just immigrants by the hundreds in third class, but also carry rich people in unparalleled luxury. The White Star Line's three ships would be called the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. Albert Ballin decided to build three ships of his own. They would be even bigger than the White Star ships. They would be called the Imperator, the Vaterland, and the Bismarck. Very patriotic German names. And the first of the White Star Line's new ships, the Olympic, makes its debut in 1911. She's seen as this absolute wonder ship. She's shown here on the lower left. The Imperator, the first of the Hamburg-American Line's new ships, is slated to arrive in 1913. The Ballin ships could carry 3,000 people in steerage. Truly incredible. Now, we don't know much about the Olympic. We don't know much about the Britannic, but we know a lot about the second ship of the White Star trio. This was an absolute disaster, not just for travel in North Atlantic, but for the 1,500 people who died, but also for J.P. Morgan. The Titanic was commissioned in April of 1912, and she was the second ship of this class. She was not greeted with all that much fanfare. She was only half full when she sailed on April 10th, 1912. She carried in first class many prominent members of America's Jewish upper class, most notably Isidore and Ida Strauss, who were, he was the co-owner of Macy's department store. He was a leader in Jewish charities, a very close friend of Jacob Schiff. Also on board was the mining magnate Benjamin Guggenheim, who was traveling with his French mistress. In third class, you had maybe around 50 or so Jews of the 770 or so in third class. And in second class, you had traveling a Jewish couple named Sinai and Miriam Cantor. They were from the village of Vitebsk in the Russian Empire. They had saved up enough money to travel second class on the Titanic because the theory was if you traveled second or first class, you'd saved up enough money as an immigrant, you could skip the line at Ellis Island. You were considered by the U.S. Immigration Service to be, oh, if you have that much money, you probably don't have a disease. The Cantors were carrying in the cargo hold of the Titanic cases of Russian furs, which they intended to sell to finance their medical studies. Well, 4 days after the Titanic set sail from Southampton, she was only 2 days away from New York. She strikes an iceberg in the middle of the night. And for the first hour or so, people really don't want to get off the ship. It's brightly lit. It's warm. It's the middle of the night. Why would you want to get into a 30-foot lifeboat and be lowered 7 stories into the North Atlantic? It's pretty darn scary. An officer approached Isidore Strauss and said, Mr. Strauss, you're a former congressman. You're a respected older man. Please get in a lifeboat and just set an example. And he said, no, can't do that. Not before the younger men. His wife said, I'm not leaving you. Famously said, we've been living together for many years. Where you go, I go. So as we have lived, so we shall die together. Ida Strauss was one of 4 first-class women who perished that night. Third class was a different story. Water coming into the third class areas fairly early on, and they assembled in the public rooms and didn't know what to do. They were told to stay in place. There were no lifeboats in the third class areas, and they weren't let up until the very end, until almost the time the ship went down 2.5 hours later. More first class men survived than third class children on the Titanic. And if the ship had been fully loaded, with 3,500 passengers and crew versus the 2,200 she was carrying, the disaster would have been even worse, much, much worse. Uh, the ship had lifeboat spaces for 1,200, and only 705 of those seats were filled. Uh, a week after the disaster, a ship that was chartered by the White Star Line, a cable ship, arrived on the scene of the disaster to retrieve bodies. Among those pulled from the sea, they were all wearing life jackets. Those that were floating was Isidor Straus, but also Sinar Cantor's body was pulled from the North Atlantic, and this watch was recovered from his body. A silver watch that shows Moses receiving the Ten Commandments on one side and Hebrew characters on the other. And these effects were sent to his wife, who survived the disaster. This was a disaster for Morgan's company, the White Star Line, and for the International Mercantile Marine. He dies in disgrace in 1913. And this was a story that was told to me by my grandmother, and I realized this impacted the Jewish community in America. I mean, there was songs and also in Yiddish theater written about them. They were seen as martyrs for the Jewish community and how a Jewish couple should act in the face of disaster. What was bad for the White Star Line was great for the Hamburg-American Line. Between 1913 and 1914, two of its grand new ships arrive on the scene, the Imperator and the Vaterland. And for Albert Ballin, this was great. For Germany, this was great. His two ships were immensely popular, but Albert Ballin was terrified of one thing. The one thing that scared him the most was Germany getting embroiled in a war with England or Russia. And Albert Ballin worked very hard behind the scenes to stop Germany entering a war. He knew that would end the immigrant business, especially if Germany went to war with Russia. Unfortunately, the German government, the military, was led by a group of people that Albert Ballin would later dismiss as office boys and incompetent. They were itching for a fight. They wanted to gain more land, especially in Russia. And they had this rather harebrained idea that Germany could win a two-front war against France on one side and Russia on the other. Just before Germany declared war in 1914, the summer of 1914, Albert Ballin made an emergency trip to England to see his good friend, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill embraced his friend Albert Ballin and said, "Dear sir, please let us not go to war." Unfortunately, Germany did go to war. Most of the Hamburg-American Line's 175 ships were stuck in U.S. ports and unable to leave when the war started in the summer of 1914. Albert Ballin declared, "My life's work is ruined." Immigration was totally cut off, and the company essentially went bankrupt. Albert Ballin's worst fears were realized. He knew that Germany was going to get defeated eventually. And it was a catastrophe, absolute catastrophe for all parties involved in this war, in which millions upon millions of people died unnecessarily, and one of the dumbest wars in modern history, if not the dumbest. Hundreds of thousands of Jews in Germany and Austria-Hungary loyally served their respective emperors during the war. Russia invaded Poland and Russia invaded a big chunk of Austria-Hungary during the war, and there were mass pogroms in this part of the empire in Galicia, and there's no way for them to get out. And all the Russian Jews who were stuck there, they were drafted into the army, and conditions were terrible. And Jacob Schiff did what he could to send aid to Jewish refugees on the Eastern Front. But Jacob Schiff quickly became a rather suspect figure in American high finance because he never really could disavow Germany. He was asked, "Why don't you float a loan for the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia?" And he said, "I can't do that because Russia is my enemy, and I can't turn against Germany." The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed 1,200 people sailing off the southwest coast of Ireland, really turned American opinion against Germany. And this also really began putting into overdrive trends that have been going on for the past 20 years of hostility against immigrants. And without mass immigration to America because of the war, a lot of people who've been working very hard behind the scenes felt this was the time to act. In the 1890s, a group of aristocrats in Boston formed something called the Immigration Restriction League. This is something that was sort of seen as sort of a fringe organization, but it was made up of prominent people in high society and in academia, business, who began really taking in and reading a lot of material that was being pumped out of France and Germany that we today call scientific racism. And they began publishing in first their organizational's magazine, but eventually this stuff would find its way to mainstream publications such as Harper's, and would eventually find its way into the U.S. Congress through its mouthpiece, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, shown in the center, saying that there's a hierarchy of races in Europe. And in the olden times, America benefited from immigrants from the British Isles, from Germany. But now we have these people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Jews, Greeks. These people are dangerous because they are low IQ, they are not, they can't be assimilated into American life. And a person that really made this into a popular thing in the publishing world was Madison Grant, a lawyer who never worked. He was independently wealthy, like many of these guys, shown here on the left. And he wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race, and in 1916, which became a pretty big seller. And he said the biggest problem is, what if these people start interbreeding with the Nordic stock that makes up America? That will be the end of America. And it's interesting, Madison Grant had no children of his own, but he was very, very, very obsessed with the breeding habits of other people. It's something that sort of seems like a common thread among a lot of these people who would eventually call eugenicists. But in 1917, when America entered the war, the Immigration Restriction League was finally able to ram through Congress a immigration restriction bill based on ethnicity, not based on whether or not you were an anarchist or whether or not you didn't have enough money to support yourself. It was based on ethnicity, heavily biased against Jews and Italians. And this culminated in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act, which effectively barred all immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Albert Ballin died in 1918, just 2 days before the armistice, a broken and sad man. His faith in Germany, his faith in a lot of things had just collapsed. And he saw what was going to happen to the Hamburg-American Line. It essentially fell apart after the war. It was able to rebuild, but it never became what it once was because of the immigration restrictions. These immigration restrictions would remain in place until 1965 and would in effect condemn to death hundreds of thousands of Jews in Eastern Europe and Germany who were trying to get out in the 1930s and couldn't. And in closing, this story would not have been possible without the cooperation of the descendants of many of the people of the three main characters I've written about. Jacob Schiff died in 1920, and at his funeral outside of Temple Emmanuel in New York, there were tens of thousands of Jews who had trooped up to the Lower East Side to pay their respects to the man that had made America das goldene Land for them. And I am grateful for the cooperation of descendants of Jacob Schiff and the Warburg family for opening up their archives. I am also grateful to the descendants of Max Warburg, who fled Germany in 1938. Eventually, his son would return to Hamburg to reclaim the family bank and the mansion. They opened up their archives to me. And then also, miracle of miracles, the descendants of Albert Ballin's daughter, Irmgard. In 2021, I was able to finally make contact with Albert Ballin's great-grandson, Heinz Weber, who's descended from Irmgard, who was an adopted daughter. The family was raised Lutheran, but by the 1930s, it became very clear that being related to a prominent Jew in Germany, even by adoption, was dangerous. The Weber Bielefeld family packed away all of Albert Ballin's letters, personal effects papers, and sent them to a hiding place at a family home in Innsbruck, Austria. That's how these papers escaped destruction from the firebombing of Hamburg, Germany in 1944, and from searches by the Nazis. I was able to, after many conversations with Heinz, he said, "You can come to Austria and I could show you what I have." And after a very long trip during COVID, I was able to reach their home near the village of Freistadt in Austria. And after 2 hours of conversation with Heinz and his wife Ingrid, they said, "Wait a minute, we trust you. We think you can make good of this." They came out, they went to a back room, came back with 2 thick-bound volumes of all of Albert Ballin's letters saying, "We transcribed them during COVID and this is for you." So I'm grateful to so many people who have allowed me to tell this previously untold story. And these 3 men, Albert Ballin, Jacob Schiff, and J.P. Morgan, they worked with each other, against each other. They had different motives: profit, philanthropy, ambition. But without their work, tens of millions of us would not be here today. As one Jewish immigrant said, she said, "I thought about this all the time, that journey my parents made from Russia, because to us it was a matter of life and death, because all of my mother's family in their small town, they all perished in the 1940s when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and we lived because of that journey." And in closing, final closing, I could not have written this book without the love and support of my wife, who, in addition to being a phenomenal emergency room doctor, is also was a history and German major. And we made several trips to Germany to do research. And our last, on a recent trip in March of this past year, we visited the Warburg family in Hamburg. Max Warburg, the grandson of the Max I wrote about, his wife Najla, and their son Eric. And this picture was taken in the Warburg family home, which was reclaimed by the family against all odds after the Nazis had seized it. And yes, part of the immigration village still survives. This picture shown, one of the pictures in the center, shows my eldest son Isaac as a pretty much a baby at the immigration village near the spot where his great grandparents left for America, next to the blessing, "The good life awaits you." So this is a story that has not been told for generations, but affects most Americans of Jewish ancestry. We want to know where we came from, what we were fleeing from, and what America represents to us. And in this age where Jewish life is really becoming seemingly very scary right now, uncertain, we need to look back at not just what's going on now, not just at the Holocaust in Germany, and remember, for some perspective, during the 19th century, Germany was seen as relatively progressive. It was Russia that wrote the book on state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and it was from Russia that most of our people fled for their lives. And we need perspective of what that journey meant and what America represents to us. So thank you so much, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Can you unshare your screen so we can put back
Of course.
the gallery? Okay. So I want to be respectful of time, and it's almost an hour, so I want to keep it sort of quick, but any questions before I monopolize the questions. I see Camille, you had you put a comment in there. If you unmute, yeah.
Yes. Hi, Stephen. Thank you for everything that you've brought to us, including the book. I have an inkling that some of the families that participated in helping with the research had a very, very positive agenda behind that help, in the sense of there's some message we want to get across to people around what our ancestors did or what they stood for. And given what you just mentioned about the current times, what do you think they were trying to say?
The people who helped me out, like the Warburgs.
Yeah.
I think that what the Warburgs, the example of the Warburgs was fascinating because they, you know, the German branch fled to America and barely survived. I mean, they lost everything. I think what they wanted to tell, and they're still the current Warburgs are still there. They're still Jewish. They're once become leaders of Germany's Jewish community, which is now only 100,000 or so. And I think what they wanted to pass on is that throughout the worst, we survived. We fought back. We even after the worst of circumstances, we endured. The Warburg family in Germany, they have a foundation that still, even at this time, works hard to restore Jewish property that was stolen by the Nazis. There's a wonderful woman working for them named Dorothea Hauser, who that's her full-time job, is helping Jews who have lost property, art, real estate, even all these decades after the Holocaust, to get back what was theirs. So for me, what I was impressed with was the persistence. And also the Ballin descendants, or the descendants of his adopted daughter, Irmgard, who loved her father dearly, absolutely adored him, I mean, this was sort of a case of righteous among the nations. I mean, the Ballin descendants were in a very weird position. They were linked to a prominent Jew. They did not disavow him. They protected him. I mean, Albert Ballin's grandsons served in the Kriegsmarine during the 1940s. I mean, they probably had no choice. But all during that time, they were hiding those papers. They were like, we are not. I mean, that portrait that Heinz was standing behind or in front of, that was hidden. I mean, it was really that was an incredible story of how the descendants of, by adoption of this prominent Jew felt this tremendous amount of obligation. So I think what the Warburgs and the Ballins want to show is a legacy of survival, of even when the worst happens for you, you don't run away, you confront it. Does that make sense, Camille?
It resonates on a deep, deep level. So thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Nancy.
Oh, well, someone raised their hands.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I really love this book. I'm a folklorist, and I'm also a historian, an architectural historian. So
Oh, wonderful.
I relate to a lot of your approaches in the book. And one of the things that I really loved is your focus on the experiences of immigrants, in that transatlantic journey and getting to the ships and, being screened before they even got on the ships. And I'm hoping you might be able to share with us a little bit about how you decided to focus on, which families that you describe in that kind of detail, and how you found out about them, what kinds of resources you used.
Oh boy. Well, I mean, it was a bit of a struggle because I was looking at all these prominent people and who could I confirm traveled on a Hapag ship. And thankfully I found the Bacall Weinstein family. And they were from Romania, which was adjacent to the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire and Romania had sort of interlinked governments. Both were very anti-Semitic. And this family left, I believe, in 1903 aboard the SS Deutschland, which was a Hapag vessel. And, this young girl who was traveling with her parents, she eventually became the mother of Lauren Bacall, the famous actress who sort of defined, she set the standards for 1930s Hollywood beauty. A fun fact that I found out recently was my great uncle, Irwin Brooks, dated her when they were young. That was kind of funny. But then she went on to marry Humphrey Bogart, oh well. But yeah, I mean, I looked through her memoirs. I went on, Ellis Island. I went through Ancestry.com, and that's how I was able to reconstruct that story. And how Lauren Bacall, I mean, she was originally Betty Joan Persky, but then she changed her name, talked about how close she was with her grandmother, the immigrant grandmother, who was very religious. And she said that her anger, she had a lot of anger, a lot of sadness. She had been through a lot in life. Like her husband, Max, I think had a very hard time in America. He was a cart operator. He eventually had a candy store. But like a lot of the first generation immigrants, they kind of like struggled. A lot of them did not become wealthy. A lot of them sort of economically struggled. They wanted a better future for their kids. And Max Weinstein, basically age 57, laid down and died. He was just so sad. He was so broken, homesick. And his wife had to carry on. And Lauren Bacall said of her grandmother, she didn't show emotion all that much, very stoic. But when something would set her off, she said her temper was wild because all that pain had to come out somehow. So I think that was a common thing among a lot of this first generation, was a kind of emotional repression due to trauma.
So I see Mitchell has his hand up as well.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating story. One of the things that struck me in what you presented was the duality of both the shipping lines as a business enterprise and also as a humanitarian effort. And I was particularly wondering how this was reflected in the pricing of the passage tickets, especially for third class. How accessible was this for many of the potential immigrants? And did Ballin's influence on the Hauppauge line result in more affordability of the passage on that line compared to some of the others? Thank you.
Well, actually, the Hauppauge ships the bigger ones cost a little bit more. And his argument was, well, you get somewhat better service, you get better treated. And this was not a cheap journey. I mean, this was maybe the equivalent of steamship tickets alone, maybe $1,500 a person, which for a peasant family, it's a lot of money. I mean, I think when you factored in steamship tickets, the cash you had to have on your person when you showed up at Ellis Island, all that, it was like a $10,000 to $15,000 thing for a family. Sometimes the husband would go first, and there are many cases where the husband would go first and then would run off with another woman and leave the family back at home, abandoned. The term was aguna, I believe. And so that was a crummy situation for a lot of Jewish women left behind in the old country. All of a sudden, one day, the money would just stop showing up. But I don't think Albert Ballin offered preferential prices. His argument was, I create better conditions on board than other competing lines. And he basically, by 1910, conditions on his ships had gotten so much better that, like, it was a word of mouth thing. It's like, oh, take a Hauppauge ship and you got kosher food and you'll be well treated. And people would go and talk about it to their relatives. So that was his thinking. But the immigrant aid societies and the German Jewish Aid Society in particular helped subsidize tickets for people that just showed up through the border control stations. So it was a whole network. But Ballin, I think, saw it as business. I think he cared at his heart of hearts. he cared for the immigrants, but I think that he could not show that publicly. Not in Imperial Germany, and not in front of his investors.
Okay, see, there's one more question. Eileen, do you want to ask yourself, or you want me to read it? No? All right, well, how about Jerry?
Stephen, thank you very much. That was most informative and a great presentation. Two quick questions. A few years ago, we visited the American Jewish History Museum. I don't know if I got the words in the right order, in Philadelphia. We found it very, very interesting. I was wondering to what extent their resources were of any help to you. Also, there's a community in southern Florida adjacent to PGA National called Ballin, Ohio. I don't even know if it's spelled the same way, but is that any connection to Albert Ballin?
I actually did not really use the Jewish Museum in Philadelphia all that much. And no, as far as I know, that community, I don't know anything about the community. I wish I could help you with that one. So.
Okay, Marcia, I was
Yes.
going to ask, when did the last ship actually leave Hamburg? And was it a way for Jews to finally make the final way out?
I mean, I don't have funny enough, I don't know the name of the last ship from Hamburg, but I think it was the summer of 1914 that the last ships left, and before the British mined the North Sea, basically locking Germany into a blockade that eventually 4 years later would starve Germany into submission. But effectively, transatlantic service ceased, not just for the Hapag, but for North German Lloyd, for White Star. The ships were taken over as troop transports. America seized most of Hapag's ships when it entered the war in 1917, those that were stuck in U.S. ports. That really destroyed the line. So there's, I mean, aside from like a few ships, like the Lusitania was the only big ship left in service in 1915, and we know what happened to her. But people didn't want to travel. I mean, it was like, why would you want to travel across the Atlantic when it's bristling with U-boats?
Okay. Well, I want to be respectful and we've run over, but that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. And so the book is Last Ships from Hamburg, and you can buy it at a local bookstore. You can buy it on Amazon. You can get your hands on it somewhere. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth reading. And I sense a theme in your books, a little nautical theme there. Are you working on anything that you can
I
share
have a
with
few
us?
ideas right now, but I'm not at liberty to talk about them now, but I will stay tuned.
Fair enough. Okay, well then I would thank you so much. We've been honored to have you with us, and that was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.